Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, All in Her Mind, as part of the Cambridge Festival. My name's Kate Womersley. I'm a doctor in psychiatry and a researcher, and I have the real pleasure today of speaking with Professor Linda Gask and Dr. Rebecca Lawrence. We're joining you from Scotland today. Rebecca and I are in Edinburgh, and Linda is joining us from Orkney. Linda and Rebecca are two clinicians I hugely admire, and we're here to celebrate and learn from their new books that have been released in towards the end of 2024. So firstly, Rebecca Lawrence is a consultant in addiction psychiatry here in Edinburgh. This is her first book, but she's written widely for The Guardian, for Prospect Magazine, and also for her own blog, charting her experience of mental illness and being a psychiatrist, called Doctor and Patient. Her new book, An Improbable Psychiatrist, is a memoir about living with severe mental illness, in her case, bipolar disorder, and her experiences of the psychiatric system as a patient, as a mother, a partner, and a doctor in training. Then welcome Linda. Linda Gask is Emerita Professor of Primary Care Psychiatry at the University of Manchester. She's written two memoirs about mental illness, The Other Side of Silence and Finding True North, and also writes a blog, Patching the Soul. So this is her third book, Out of Her Mind, which shares her personal reflections about training in psychiatry, working in psychiatry, managing periods of her own depression, and she reflects broadly and ambitiously on the care and sometimes the care that women and girls don't receive for their mental health in this country and actually globally. So passages are autobiography, and those are combined with literature, with cultural commentary and social analysis. Linda, Rebecca, and I actually have already done a roundtable event in Edinburgh to mark International Women's Day, and this was just a few weeks ago. And our audience there was primarily clinicians and doctors, but of course, these books speak much broadly, they speak powerfully and really very eloquently far outside of our profession. So we're all really glad to be having this chance to expand our initial lines of conversation and to think with you as a more diverse audience. Before we get started and deep into our conversation, there are just a few things for you to know about how to participate in today's event. You're all currently in listening mode, but you're not going to be relegated to perpetual silence. There will be a moment for you to ask questions, but you can submit at any time. So you do this just by typing into the Q&A pane on the control panel at the bottom of Zoom. Any trouble, just put comments in the chat. So please just send us any thoughts, comments, and questions. And as I said, just whenever those come to you, and then I will collect those as we go through and put your questions to Linda and Rebecca towards the end of the session in our Q&A. If we don't get through all your questions, they will be included in a document that will be sent out along with the recording of this webinar. If you have any technical difficulties, you can just flag this in the Q&A box to our team and they'll hopefully sort that out for you. Obviously, if we have any technical difficulties, which I hope you won't, we will message you as our attendees and restart the webinar. In terms of the timeline, so we're going to speak for about 45 minutes and then we'll turn to your questions. As I said, there'll be a short survey at the end, so part of that will be about you adding extra questions, but also raising any comments you have. So welcome, Linda. Welcome, Rebecca. You're sitting here with us as consultant psychiatrists, as published authors, and I wondered if you could first take us back to the start of your careers, so to paint a picture for us about who you were then and what was on your mind at the time. I'll put that to you first, Linda.
Well, when I left medical school in Edinburgh, I was very young. I was 23. I'd experienced problems with my mental health as a medical student. I'd actually seen a psychiatrist and being prescribed benzodiazepines. I wasn't sure whether I could be a psychiatrist, but I got back in touch with my consultant and he said yes. He thought I would be able to manage it, but there might be times when it would be difficult, which turned out to be right. And I was really keen to work hard and show people what I could do, um,
Mm.
which often led to me working a bit too hard. Um, I I think I burned out on more than one occasion and then got quite depressed. But that's how I was at the beginning of my career. I think I was quite a different person to who I am now. Um, certainly aware of, I was certainly extremely anxious.
Mm. That experience of having someone tell you that you could be a psychiatrist, you could
Mhm,
do what you dreamt to do,
mhm,
is in slight contrast, Rebecca, with some of your early experiences where you had doubt that psychiatry could be a career open to you.
Yes, I started as a medical student with little idea of what I wanted to do. Like Linda, I was very young. I was 17 when I went to medical school, graduated at 22, and I'd had a very unfortunate psychiatry attachment during medical school. I mean, I was failed on this attachment and never told why. So at that point, I thought, well, that's that over. And it was the one thing I did think I might like to do. So instead, I went into
mhm,
and did my training in general practice, and during that became fairly suddenly and acutely unwell. Um, when I was pregnant, actually, with my first daughter, and it ended up having a couple of years off and being an inpatient in a psychiatric hospital. After that, I thought, well, that's it. I've really blown it now. Um, and to be honest, I just, in the end, I thought, well, I've nothing to lose. And that's kind of why I went ahead and applied for psychiatric training. It wasn't always easy to get. In those days, some people were prejudiced against those of us who had psychiatric disorders, just thought they maybe shouldn't be working in it. I think I remember one chap saying, psychiatrist, saying that, you know, if you became ill when you were a consultant, you might be okay. And it was progressively less hopeful as you went down the stages to being a medical
mhm.
student. And I was fairly well down at that point. So that wasn't encouraging. Yeah.
Mm. And this was a time when medicine had far fewer women than it currently does.
It was
Um,
fewer. Yeah.
yeah. And also being a patient was very different then. I wonder, sort of bringing us back now into the present, what
Yeah.
do you both think are the key challenges that face women and girls with mental health problems? And that's 1 in 5 women and girls in the UK. The difficulties they face, which may be distinct from or different to the challenges that men and boys face. Rebecca.
Yeah. I think that's difficult. I mean, I think there are a lot more challenges. There's a lot more recognition of distress and mental health problems. And I think the
Mm.
first thing we have to think is we can't just put them all into one bucket kind of thing, or one basket, maybe is a better word. And that some of our problems will be the same as boys and men have, but some of them will be quite different. And, you know, if things like connected with menstruation, menopause, these things are all, I think a lot of women still feel a bit embarrassed or shamed by them, particularly if men are around. And there needs to be better ways of managing that and problems that are more associated with them, you know, connected with hormones, etc. Um, I think I think there is better recognition. There are a lot more women, and there's more women working in it. It's not always better at the coal face, though. You know, it doesn't always feel like things are as changed as they probably need to be. And I think some of that is about recognizing the difference between probably severe mental illness and understandable distress about, you know, having to work too hard, having family, you know, just everything being too much and other things going on. And there's often a lot in between that. So we can't just say, you know, this is a woman, she's got these problems. We need to be saying, this is a woman, I want to find out more about her and get to know her and see what is going on for her. And I think we're a bit under resourced, really, would be my conclusion. I think with that we haven't got enough people who have the time to do that kind of work or
Mm.
getting to know people.
Mm. It struck me reading your book that that is an area where psychiatry has seemed to make quite significant advances in the last couple of decades in terms of perinatal mental health care of women around the risk period of pregnancy and the postpartum, understanding hormonal fluctuations as potentially a risk factor for mental health problems. But as you say, there is a danger then of pathologizing
Mm.
normal physiological events, whether that's having a period or approaching menopause. And
Or
I think
bereavement. I mean, anything really.
yeah,
Job losses. You know, everything is. Things aren't just black and white. I mean, it's very difficult. I
mm,
do think the perinatal services are very different than when I was first unwell. I mean, well, there weren't really any. I was an inpatient in the same place where I had my failed attachment, which was quite distressing actually.
yeah,
Yeah, there wasn't any kind of perinatal follow up or support or
mm.
anything. And I think that's very, very different now.
And if you in Edinburgh had been unwell today, you would have potentially come to the mother and baby unit where I currently
Yeah,
work, which
yeah,
is an extraordinary service.
yes,
There are many of these throughout the UK where
yeah.
women can receive intense psychiatric care alongside their babies. Obviously, their babies are just there to flourish and to develop that bond with their mother, but there isn't that
I did get to
catastrophic.
take my baby in actually for a little while into what was Ward 1, I think, in the Royal Edinburgh at that point. But it
Okay.
wasn't a great experience for either of us, I don't think. I mean,
Challenging
people
when it,
did their best, but there wasn't the resource there. You
yeah.
know, I've been very lucky. And one thing I always want to say really is that, you know, I've had a couple of psychiatrists over the years, and I've been able to have the same psychiatrist. And there's, you know, there was recently stuff about, I was in the BBC, wasn't it, about bipolar disorder and the importance of people getting long-term follow-up. And I think I don't know whether because I'm a doctor or because I'm someone who's able to maybe access help better. I don't know, but I've been extremely lucky in having really two long-term psychiatrists now.
Yeah,
And
continuity of
they
care.
get to know you. They get to know what's not right and what's right, so they don't overreact or underreact. Yeah,
And you don't have to keep telling your story again and again. So, and that can
yeah,
be tiring and
yeah.
re-traumatizing.
Well, it
Linda, what
becomes
about you?
real.
Oh, sorry.
I was just say the story starts to become. You almost don't believe it yourself after a while, so it becomes difficult to tell. Yeah. Sorry.
Linda, your thoughts about the challenges that women and girls face that may be different to those that men and boys face?
I think the challenges differ according to where you are in society as a woman.
Hmm.
I think we must not underestimate the impact of deprivation on women.
Yeah.
Um, you know, more women, there's more women on benefits in our society, more women who are single parents, more women who are carers,
Mm.
more women who've experienced domestic violence. And that contributes a lot to the excess of common mental health problems that women have, um, depression and anxiety, and also post-traumatic stress disorder. And when you know, I spent several years working in Preston, which is quite a middle class place, and then I spent several years working in Salford, which is at the opposite end of the scale. And what I saw in Salford were I was working, you know, with a service that was set up to provide psychological therapies. And a lot of people thought, oh, we'd be dealing with people with mild mental health problems. You know, these would be people with worries who would bother us, and we'd be able to send them away with some advice. And we were overwhelmed with women. Two-thirds of our clientele were women, and they had major problems. And they were too unwell for the specialist. They were too unwell for their GP, but they weren't unwell enough for the psychiatric services. And the context in which they had become unwell was often completely ignored by society. Um, they had broken families. They had sometimes come from families where there'd been abuse as a child. They were victims of domestic violence. And what I think is often lacking in psychiatry is linking those two things together, that the woman becomes the problem rather than us saying the man who beat her up is actually the problem. And we have got some real problems, I think, in linking those two together and making those links in our society. And the service I worked in, we did our best to link up with all of those services for women. But of course, working through after after 2008, all of those services were run down and women's centres were reliant on temporary funding. The places where women could get that kind of long-term support, women who are trying to deal with the problems of childhood trauma simply don't benefit from 6 sessions of CBT from a therapist who's had 1 year's training. But we couldn't get them access to the kind of therapy that they needed. And that was the kind of therapy that I benefited from in my younger life. I didn't have I didn't have anywhere near the kind of traumatic childhood that many of my women patients had, but I did have issues with, I think, with emotional neglect, and that, you know, that resulted in many of the problems that I had, and I benefited from long-term therapy on the NHS, which enabled me to deal with a lot of those issues. But now it's quite hard for women to get that unless they pay privately. And so I think we have a system that's kind of not set up to provide women with what they need to recover. And that's not just about therapy, it's about all of those other agencies in the community that can actually provide support. You know, at our women's centre, we had a group where women met who had experienced violence, and that group was really powerful and supported women. But it was always on short-term funding.
Yeah. You talk about the intersection of sex and gender and class, and also in your book, you talk about intersectionality in regards to race and ethnicity, and that also contributing to risk for mental illness, but also risk for poor treatment and lack of access to treatment.
Yes, I think, I mean, working in Manchester, I spent some time both researching and working with women from the South Asian population. And it was, I mean, I start the book off talking about a debate which was entitled Men Are the Losers Now, which was for Women's Week in Manchester. And it was really, I mean, I was asked to speak for the opposing that. And as I spoke, I looked around the audience and we were all white women, white middle-class women mostly. And I had spent the day out in the community in Salford with white working class women, but also I spent my other time out with women who really would have difficulty leaving the house without their husband's permission. Women who couldn't speak English, women who were being sent appointments in a language that they couldn't understand, and just kind of feeling that we kind of don't take those things into consideration. I think when we think about women, we need to think intersectionality is just so powerful. And I say that as a woman, you know, who was brought up working class, and I was well aware that many of the women from the white working class in Salford also had great difficulty accessing care.
And thank goodness we're moving away from terms like people who are hard to access, particularly women who are hard to access, or women who are disengaging from care, and services are becoming a bit more curious about how care might be set up in a way that makes access immensely challenging.
Yes, I think you have to go out into the community and link in with people and link in with the organisations who link with them, and that's what we did in Manchester. And we also did that. We have a large Jewish community in Manchester, and again, there are women in the Orthodox Jewish community who have large families and don't leave home very much, and don't use NHS services. And we set up a similar system within our unit, reaching out to that community with and training people from that community to work with us. You have to do that community engagement, particularly, I think, to get in touch with women who are at home.
Yeah. for care, but also for research. I think that the
Yes.
PPI movement in research is really to be celebrated, but it does need to, I think, go even
Mm.
further to actually authentically represent people, not people who necessarily just come forward to be involved in research.
Yes, absolutely.
Rebecca, I
Can I say,
wondered,
yeah,
yeah, please
sorry,
go ahead.
I was just going to kind of add to that. I work almost totally in drugs and alcohol services, and specifically on an inpatient ward and in the chronic pain service. And I think I'm just very aware that when we see women, they are often, well, much more damaged, or things
Mhm.
are just much harder for them than some of the men. And that may be because of the fact that they're women physically, that they have children, that they, are rejected in some way, I think, as women who drink particularly. I think there's something, really what I wanted to sort of draw attention to was the kind of shame that women experience, and they shame themselves. They say themselves they're ashamed, but I strongly feel you don't make yourself, ashamed at the beginning. Somebody is saying to you, you're shameful, or you shouldn't do that. And I'm certainly not saying that people should drink and look after children, but I do think that you can't help people while shaming them and being derogatory in any way. I mean, these women are, they need our help, and I think the issue of shame for me is one that is very much there, and I think it's more for women than men, although it can be there for both.
Mm.
Really, just to mention that.
And that feeling of shame isn't foreign to your own story about what it
No,
means to have mental
yeah,
health problems, and how that might interfere with or interact with your professional role. And I wonder if
yeah.
you'd read from the book now, Rebecca.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I would like to say that, my experiences do not compare with many of my patients. I'm not trying to say that in any way. But yes, I was in a difficult situation, being both patient and maybe, at the point when I'm going to read, I wasn't a psychiatrist. I was a GP trainee, and I'd become unwell, and one of my colleagues had taken me to see a psychiatrist. And I'll just read a brief bit here. She took me to see a psychiatrist in a large old house that frightened me. I had no idea what to say. The psychiatrist was large and fat. How would you feel about going to stay somewhere for a couple of weeks, Rebecca, just until you feel better? It would give you a bit of a break. No, I'm not doing that. I knew this was no holiday she was offering. The psychiatrist sighed. That's a pity. And if you change your mind, she paused. One other thing, I won't take any notes, so none of this should affect your career. I looked away. To me, this was clear confirmation that what was happening would indeed end my career. Why otherwise would nothing be recorded? Was it because I was a doctor that mental illness meant disgrace? I remembered some of the stigmatizing conversations I had heard about staff who ended up on the wrong side of psychiatry. I knew that it was indeed the end. No notes then. That's that little bit. And there's another bit which was quite soon after that, when things got worse for me, and my colleague, friend really, took me to, she took me across the moor to Bodmin. We were down in Cornwall. So I knew nothing of this place, save that it had once been an asylum, with all the implications that came along with this. When we got there, I spoke to one of the doctors, who asked me quite a lot of questions that I didn't know how to answer. I think you need to come into hospital, he said eventually. No, I won't. I'm not doing that. I looked at my friend wildly. Please tell them I can't do that. She just shook her head and said nothing. I won't stay. Well, then, I think we'll have to look at the possibility of keeping you here under the Mental Health Act if you won't stay voluntarily. I couldn't speak. She put her hand on mine and said quietly, I don't think that will be necessary. I had no choice. The Mental Health Act meant that I would be sectioned, that I would be unable to leave. If this happened, then everything would be over. Notes would be taken, and I would never work again. And I stayed. And that's that bit. And I think one of the things there that I particularly think of looking back was the kind of need to, not keep notes, but in particular, the concept of being detained or sectioned, which, I mean, understandably, people find terrifying. But the problem is, I mean, the actuality is, I mean, I have been detained since then, and it hasn't affected my career. But I didn't know that then, and no one could explain it. And I guess, I think what the main thing really, though, is that if you are actually detained, you will have rights. You'll have rights to appeal, rights to get someone else to see you. This thing, which happened to me on more than one occasion, of being sort of de facto detained, that you're in hospital, feel you can't leave, but there's nothing actually formally in place, isn't a very good one. And I think, I don't know if that's very specific to women doctors or what, but it's not something that we should be doing. And I have to say now, and I've said to my husband, should I ever require to be admitted, I wouldn't want to be in that position. I'd rather be not admitted, agree to admission, or detained, not kind of persuaded to stay in, or you will be detained, because that's not a good position to be in for anyone. And it doesn't give the right impression. It means people learn that it's a shaming, bad thing to happen.
And reinforces that feeling that it's somehow, if you're good, if you stay on good behavior,
Yes.
then you'll be allowed to have an informal status.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there was a lot of, I mean, it's hard for me to say because I don't remember completely, and I think the nurses were under a lot of pressure, but there was quite a lot of sort of infantilizing, I think, of patients, and probably especially, I think that was especially women, and it probably didn't get people to behave in ways that were good for them. I mean, I don't think anyone who's been a psychiatric patient is going to look back and think, gosh, I really did that well. I mean, I'm not. I am ashamed of what I was like, what happened, and I've been in a fortunate position to not require admission because I get community treatments. I have community ECT, maintenance ECT, which I had yesterday, and I take medication as advised, and that keeps me reasonably well, and I'm glad about that. But you just you can't say how things are necessarily going to be. And I consider myself lucky. I've got one other bit that I'll read if that's okay.
Please. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Which was, I got back to work, finished my general practice training, actually back up in Scotland, and then I decided that I thought it'd be quite difficult for me to get a general practice job, particularly as they're small businesses, and I'd been off sick. That wasn't about my the why I was off sick. That to me, that was just something that was. So I thought, well, why not give this a try? This is something I've always wanted to do. And I'm just going to read a brief paragraph about people's views. A lot of people around me seem to think that this was a bad idea on very many levels. My husband had absorbed some of the grimmer aspects of psychiatry and could not understand why I would even consider doing it. And my parents shared his views. Probably worse, actually. There were various suggestions from friends about whether I might be trying to cure myself. I cannot begin to understand this. No one would deter someone with diabetes from being an endocrinologist, even if it was slightly motivated by the desire to gain some greater understanding of their own condition. But this seemed to be a particular issue for mental health problems. And I'll finish reading there. I think there were some other bits where I described at the time the difficulty of getting jobs then, and there were difficulties for me getting jobs. I think there are different difficulties now. I'm not sure it's all gone, but we'll leave it just now.
That greater understanding you were seeking,
Yeah,
a theme through the book is this tension between, and I'm using this very much in air quotes, sort of biological illness, real
yeah,
mental
yeah,
illness,
yeah,
and behavioral symptoms or trauma-related, social
yeah.
circumstance-related difficulty. And your journey through thinking of yourself as a patient with a severe mental illness that people think of as a biological one,
Mm.
and then feeling that you might have a personality
Yeah,
disorder.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could speak about moving between those
Yeah.
two false poles, as it were.
It's an interesting thing because I think as a medical student and then junior doctor, before I even went into psychiatry, I'd worked in accident and emergency in Glasgow, and I saw people coming in and you know being referred to as having personality disorders. That was something I was aware of, and I think that then when I became unwell myself, I also became aware that those were the ones that people didn't really seem to like that much, or they felt that they were responsible. So it's very hard to know, um, even if you are disconnected from reality, or, hearing something, or, believing something that's not true, how much control you have over what you do. It's a really difficult area. And I think I've always struggled with that. I think one time was, which I think is in the book, that I was actually working in the Royal Edinburgh Hospital as a junior doctor, and my boss, the consultant who I liked, was very nice to me and said to me that he really felt I had a clear biological illness. That was clear, and I at the time I thought, great, someone's validating me, recognizing this, and then afterwards I thought, what would that mean if I didn't, and what does that mean for other people who he doesn't think do, and I still feel really uncomfortable with it. I don't think there's quite such a clear disconnect. I think, there are people we see who are very unwell, and you and Linda and I will all have seen these people, but I think for a lot of people there's a mix, and, saying things are not biological or that they're behavioral, that can be very much a criticism, and and it becomes well, a lot of it's personality, and the way people will say it, and
Absolutely.
and then there was this borderline personality disorder, which borderline just you feel like you're going over the borderline. It's just terrible, and emotionally unstable I prefer slightly, but it's not that nice. And I think the whole thing is just that it seems to be, I mean, there are men with that diagnosis, but it's more women, and they are seen more as to blame. They should be able to control that. And for myself, I don't think you have a severe psychiatric illness without a degree of effect on your personality. So, there we go. But it will always remain something that I think about, and I'm aware that I get more upset about it if I'm more unwell. That's not because it's more or less, it's just because it's something that I know people are potentially critical about. Things going on a bit about these things, but it's a difficult thing. I mean, I think the fact that there ought to be some other way of describing it, because it's
I
very
think
distressing for these
and
women.
your point is absolutely key about this notion that the illness might be separate from personality, and how could we possibly think someone might
Yeah.
live with a severe mental illness and that wouldn't affect their personality,
Yeah.
particularly in relation to how they receive care and the quality of
Yeah.
that care. And I know, Linda, you're going to read for us now about your reflections on borderline, as you call it.
Yes. I'm going to read from the chapter that I call Borderline in my book. I'll take my glasses off. It's easier to read with them off. Um, in February 1962, Marilyn Monroe checked herself into the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic in New York on the advice of her psychiatrist. She'd become increasingly distressed following the death of Clark Gable, her co-star in The Misfits, and recent divorce from the playwright Arthur Miller. The next 4 days turned into a nightmare. Locked in a bare concrete cell with barred windows, no lighting, and no buzzer to summon help, she found that she'd been institutionalized, much as her own mother before her. When darkness fell, her screams for help as she pounded on the heavy door went unheeded. Eventually, after she broke a chair against a pane of glass in the bathroom, the nurses arrived. Marilyn had never cut herself before, but she said she would do it if they did not let her out. After this incident, she was watched continuously, then carried later, face down, protesting, upstairs to an even more secure part of the building. It felt to her like she'd been imprisoned for a crime she hadn't committed. Marilyn's glamorous life as an actress couldn't be more different from those of the women I interviewed for this book. Yet when I read the letter to psychoanalyst Dr. Norman Greenson, in which she described the treatment she received in hospital as inhumane and completely without empathy, I couldn't believe how many resonances there are. Borderline personality disorder wasn't a diagnosis in the middle of the 20th century. Marilyn's psychiatrist also thought she had a form of schizophrenia. However, according to the diagnosis we make today, she would almost certainly get diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, along with depression and a substance misuse problem. And 60 years after Marilyn died, similar stories are still playing out across our healthcare systems. Emma suffered from depression from the age of 17. She wrote the following words to me. I had been sectioned and admitted for help, yet at the same time, nursing staff would declare I was not really unwell, bed blocking, and preventing people genuinely in need from being helped. Too young to know what depression was, manipulative, and simply needed to take responsibility. I felt I'd reached rock bottom when I was admitted to the ward. I assumed I'd finally be understood and helped. However, the relentless chorus from staff members who seemed not to believe in my distress fed into my despair, and I would run away or be driven further away into self-destructive coping methods. I tried to explain my difficulties in words and was told I was articulate and insightful, so shouldn't be doing the destructive things I was doing. I just felt in a double bind. Articulating my distress seemed to discredit it. After a particular difficult day, when a staff nurse said, "No one believes you, there's nothing wrong with you," I left the ward for a walk. I jumped from a road bridge in order to end my life. Emma survived with severe injuries that impact her today. Women are being admitted to private rehabilitation units across the country for a duration of months and even years for treatment. What we know happened in the past in Victorian lunatic asylums, where patients were confined to a bare room with only a mattress on the floor, food pushed through a hatch in the door, being forbidden to see, hug, talk to family or friends because of difficult behaviour and suffering assaults by staff, is still going on. When they're not believed, they're more likely to become depressed and harm themselves, just like Marilyn and 17-year-old Emma. The diagnosis that has labelled them crazy, unreliable, and not to be believed, leading to a spiral of self-destruction, is borderline personality disorder.
Claustrophobic, even just hearing that cycle of diagnosis, resistance, you could call it gaslighting from a professional perspective. And I know many people have argued that personality disorder, and particularly borderline personality disorder, emotionally unstable personality disorder, are diagnoses with misogyny baked in. Is that your feeling, Linda?
Yes, it is. I mean, I think there are certainly people that, owing to early experiences in life, have difficulty with relationships, and they have ways of defending themselves against that distress, which can make the situation worse, make them continue to have problems in relationships in adult life. That's something I understand myself. I had some of that, and it has been said about me in an Amazon review that I have borderline traits, which was a bit shocking at the time, but possibly true. But I don't see why that has to become a box that you put people into, particularly women, 3 times more women than men. And a lot of the features of extreme distress in women are features that are used to diagnose borderline personality disorder, particularly self-harm. I mean, it's got to a point where if you self-harm, emotionally unstable personality disorder, which isn't actually officially a diagnosis now in ICD or in DSM, but is still used a great deal, is almost inevitable. Whereas actually lots of people self-harm. Women do self-harm more than men, and women self-harm across many different kinds of emotional and psychiatric problems. So it's become a thing that's used against women. And the women that I spoke to, and my book is full of women's stories, for some of them, it results in them having to go to hospital for long periods where they don't get the best quality care. They certainly don't get the care that NICE recommends. And for others, it results in them actually being extruded from psychiatric care.
Mm.
And for some of them, in the end, that's actually beneficial because they're better out of the system than in it. But that's not to say that they don't acknowledge they have difficulties and problems. But the label itself results in more trauma. And the care that they get in hospital is just re-traumatizing. And I think we see that. We see that in what happens to women in inpatient units. And it's so very sad. And I think that we have to do something about it. We need to really consider why we are finding it so easy to label so many women as having a disorder when many of them actually, I think, have other problems. Some of them have BPD, bipolar disorder. I've met such women in my life who I've re-diagnosed. Some of them are undoubtedly autistic. Some of them have premenstrual dysphoric disorder. The impact of their hormones is considerable. And some of them have experienced major life trauma early in life. But the result of that is they end up having a disorder. And they don't get the kind of care that I was talking about earlier, the longer term engagement with therapy. And personally, I think we should be designing, rather than putting people into boxes and saying, you have that, you should have this, we should actually be saying, what are the particular problems you have with life and with relationships? And how can we design a therapy around you that uses components of those different therapies? For me, it was psychodynamic psychotherapy. Some people, it will be help with managing their emotions, their emotional instability. Some people, it will be mentalizing, learning how to think about how the other person is feeling. And practicing those skills. But we should be designing the therapy around the person, not saying, you have this, therefore you go into that little box. And if you don't do well in that, well, that's hard luck.
What I really appreciate
Sorry, I went on a bit about that, but
it's excellent. Is that, I think there's the other reflex, which is to say we can understand everything through the lens of trauma. And that's also, I think, a dangerous direction to go in at its extreme. And what you laid out there, that there is severe and enduring mental illness that's been missed. There is neurodiversity that's been missed, and women and girls have been historically underdiagnosed because of masking and male skewed diagnostic criteria. And the key to that is to be really specific and patient-centered. When we're
find out,
understand.
Really listen to people. And many of the women I spoke to, they didn't mind telling me their stories because I don't think they had been listened to. And too quickly, people had centered in on a diagnosis, sometimes because of difficult behavior. And it is about paying attention to the person and listening to what their story is.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm aware that we could continue talking, but we have questions in the chat. So I'm just going to turn to, there've been some lovely comments about your acknowledgement of class and vulnerable populations, people joining from across the world, and any questions here? Here we go. In what ways would you suggest that services be reconfigured to make them work better for women? Linda, I'll put that to you first.
That's not easy, but I think that it would be far better. Rebecca was talking about continuity of care, and for women, relationships are very important. I think they're probably far more important than they are for men in that sense. We do spend our life relating to people, and having continuity is crucial. That was true for me in my therapy. It was true for me with my doctor. The lack of continuity that we have in service at the moment, I think, is particularly damaging. It's damaging for everyone, but I think it does damage women. Um, I do think that we need to really focus in on how we assess and manage women who are considered to be difficult rather than rejecting. I think we must never go on the basis of previous diagnosis. Once you have borderline in your notes, that's it. It never comes off. Everything you do, including complain about services, becomes part of your personality disorder. And I think we should be paying more attention to what women ask for. The women that I spoke to were wanting to be treated with kindness, with respect. Um, some of the things that happened to them showed no kindness or respect whatsoever, particularly the way they're treated when they have a period on a general psychiatric ward. That's not a difficult thing to sort out, and yet it seems to continue to be utterly impossible. Surely we can find a way forward on how to ensure that women can actually get period products on a general psychiatric ward without it being utterly embarrassing for them.
Absolutely. So there is a combination of getting what you could class as the small things right, as well as those
Mm-hmm.
structural
Bigger things.
approaches as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Rebecca, a question for you. In what ways would you suggest that services be reconfigured to make them work? Oh, sorry, that's the one we've already had. Is there an argument for categorizing substance misuse as a coping strategy rather than a disorder in some or most cases? Wonders Anne Stevenson.
Yes, I mean, I think there is. It's often people who use substances. Many of them have come from very, very difficult backgrounds where maybe their parents have used, their families have used, their communities have, and they've maybe started to cope with difficulties or things that are happening to them. I think from working with people for many years that probably some people are perhaps biologically maybe more likely to become dependent, and some people go back into dependence more quickly. But that aside, I mean, obviously, if there wasn't any alcohol around, no one would drink it. And I think it is reasonable that, people who've, had awful things happen to them, trauma, sort of illness, whatever, are likely to take alcohol or other drugs if they make them feel better. I mean, who's to say many people wouldn't? I think it's one of those slightly awkward sort of psychiatric classification things that we have, and calling everything a disorder. I mean, that's something that might be worth looking at. But yes, I think in principle, it's yes.
Really interesting questions coming through. I wonder who on this call has recently watched Adolescence on Netflix, and this really welcome national conversation we're having about not just the mental health, but I think mental health is implicated of men and boys. I was listening to The Moral Maze at the weekend, and there was a whole discussion about the nature of men and sort of what men are like. And there's a really interesting question here about from Anna saying, I think women have to do so much negotiating in their everyday lives that talking therapies feels like more of the same. And this assumption that women just want to talk and that's part of their nature. And she adds, there's a huge need for more occupational therapy, art, dance, exercise, craft, etc. Any thoughts about that wider offering that unfortunately is not quite there all the time in the NHS?
Well, I had I think I had some psychodynamic therapy briefly, very briefly on the NHS, and it felt like something that was being done so that people could say it had been done. Really, it wasn't very. I don't know whether it would have been useful. It needed to be longer, more of a relationship formed, that kind of thing. But I do think, I mean, for me, writing, music, all these things, exercise. I mean, I've been making myself exercise recently, which is just unheard of, and it makes a huge difference. But then I'm lucky, I can afford to exercise. I mean, many of the people that, you know, Linda's talked about and we've been thinking about generally, it's very difficult for them to do this. And if people, as is in Scotland and the UK, we have a lot of people who are overweight as a result of their lives, their lifestyles, what they're eating, maybe the medication they're on. And I feel very strongly that we should be somehow helping them with that. It might make more difference than particular psychotherapy, but it's what we've got and what we can do that's difficult.
And it's finding that middle ground, isn't it? By saying, yes, exercise might help, sunlight might help,
Yes.
craft might help, music might help, but also not reducing suffering down to it's all
Yeah.
the panacea of exercise is going to absolutely sort you out. Or if you only
Hot
just fix
bath.
your nutrition, hot
Yeah.
bath, a
Yeah.
good meal, and you'll be feeling well. And
Just,
again, I think in psychiatry we need to get better at finding a nuanced and non-condescending way of making these suggestions and
yeah.
also making them easy. You know, as you say, there is a class aspect to having the money, the time to exercise.
Yeah.
It's much harder if you're a single parent. You're running working several jobs. You've got several kids under your feet. It's just much harder.
Yeah. Even
When
when,
I
sorry,
worked in, sorry, I just wanted to come in on that question. When I worked in Salford, we had an arts on prescription service that we could refer people to. And it particularly worked for people who felt that they had had enough talking therapy. Um, and it was particularly helpful also for people who were grieving and felt that they didn't want to just keep talking about it. They needed to reconnect with life. And it got people involved in creative things, and it was wonderful. But I don't know if that's still running, but I suspect it probably isn't, because it's one of those things that commissioners tend to view as being the icing on the cake, whereas
Mm.
actually it was helping people who for whom talking wasn't the right approach. I mean, it was right for me, but I know people for whom it definitely is not right.
Yeah. I worked in an intensive home treatment team and we had an arts therapist and she was received so well by so many patients and not at a time when they had moved through crisis, but actually in crisis, they were making art and that was helping them feel better. So I guess in summary, we're saying don't assume women do want to talk and don't assume men don't want to talk. We
yes.
might be in a better place. There's an interesting question here from Rebecca asking, she'd be interested to know if we think as a group that physical health issues in women are also underdiagnosed due to perceived emotional instability from GP and care providers. Rebecca thinks there's a tendency towards dismissing women's physical symptoms in general practice, i.e., you're just hormonal, you're feeling normal postnatal symptoms. Speaking from my
I,
experience, I think
yeah,
I've certainly seen that
yeah,
sort of diagnostic overshadowing that if you have, particularly if you
absolutely.
have a mental health
Yes.
disorder on your book on your record, your physical complaints are filtered through that. Anyway, Linda, any other thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that once you have an emotional diagnosis, everything else gets filtered through that. I've got chronic physical illness, and I was certainly aware at the time when it was first diagnosed and I was having problems that the fact that I have chronic anxiety and depression, or I did have at that time, and I was quite considerably worse at that time because I'd just gone through my menopause, um, that I found it quite hard to get over to people. These symptoms are real. Please listen to me. I'm actually experiencing these symptoms. And uh, until I actually ended up in hospital with sepsis, I didn't feel like anyone took it seriously. It was a dramatic moment in my life.
Hmm.
I had a not dissimilar feeling, and I may have perceived this wrong. I lost one of my babies late in pregnancy, and I got the feeling people didn't, hear what I was saying when I said the baby wasn't moving, that kind of thing. And it was, yes, I never felt, maybe because we didn't have the perinatal support team then, but I just don't think it didn't feel like people were hearing me as just a kind of, I was both a doctor, which was very annoying, and, you know, a psychiatrist and a psychiatric patient. I mean, what hope was there really? But it was very upsetting and difficult. It was actually diagnosed by a friend of mine who was an obstetrician in the end, because she said she would do another scan, which wasn't very nice for her. But you know, I think even, you know, after that as well, I was very, very, very anxious in my next pregnancy. And actually, we had a midwife who was just the best, and I could phone her any time and go in, and that, you know, that made all the difference. But it seems a bit kind of hit and miss. You know, I never quite felt that that was seen in the way that it maybe would have been seen.
Mm. And that awareness that you're likely to be disbelieved because of a pre-existing
Mm.
diagnosis only makes you more anxious when
Yeah,
you then
yeah,
go and say that and that awareness that I think I might be dismissed, that doesn't
yeah,
help the situation, does it?
yeah.
I guess also thinking on a population level from the research I do on sex and gender inclusion,
Mm.
we know that, for example, heart attacks are 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed in women. And that's a combination of lots of factors, partly because women have additional symptoms as well as the classic left-sided chest pain and dual pain, and they have things like shortness of breath and sickness that kind of confuse the picture, I guess, confuse the picture for 51% of the population. But also, there's a component of it which is gender-related bias about women presenting to A&E in distress, in agitation, with anxiety they're having a heart attack, and it's therefore seen as an emotional response rather than something more physical.
Yeah.
There's an interesting question here about keto diet, and we've all been reading about keto diet in the papers and the role that might have on mood disorders. There's a really extraordinary research group here in Edinburgh leading on this work. I wonder if either of you have thoughts on keto. Obviously, we're not saying keto is a panacea,
Yeah.
harking back to our earlier comment.
I spent quite a bit of time thinking about it and trying to read things about it. And I went to one of the recent talks about it. And I think at the moment I'm at the I mean, I think some of the research looks very, very interesting, but I'm at the stage of thinking, I don't think I could do that. So I don't quite believe in it, which isn't a very good stage. I think that, but I do genuinely think that good diet and good lifestyle is incredibly important. It's whether going for something very specific like this, I'm not sure yet. I don't know what you think, Linda.
I haven't read a great deal about it, but I know that some people feel it's very helpful.
Yeah,
But I know that there hasn't been enough
not
really
enough.
big research done on it yet. But I think it's really fascinating.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think probably we would all agree that if it's something that appeals to you as a patient and you're struggling with other options, it's worth trying with the support of a doctor. If it's something that feels manageable, and it may well be that it works for you, but like anything, like any medication, like any treatment, there's absolutely no guarantees that
And
it will
some people
be.
will need more support as well, because for some people who are, you know, natural at, you know, cooking and stuff, that may be easy, but for many people, that's not going to be easy to do.
Mm.
And so it does.
Exactly. It speaks to those class questions again about access to cooking and access
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
So, Linda, in your book, you say we must all become activists. I thought it was a really lovely way of thinking about our responsibility to each other as clinicians, as patients, as people who have women in our lives and men in our lives who may be struggling with their mental health. And you talk about activism in a very broad way, that we can all be activists in our own, whether it's in our professional work or as parents, as friends, as in the way that we show up in our jobs and our world. I wonder where you feel we should be focusing our efforts as active people in the whole mental health debate around women and girls at the moment. First to Linda.
Well, I think where we are, we need to be talking to our colleagues as much as possible to try and get them to reflect on the way they practice. And that's something that I do. I'm doing again this Friday. I had interesting feedback the last time I suggested to a group of psychiatrists that we should ditch bipolar disorder. 4 male psychiatrists got quite annoyed with me at that point. The women didn't say anything, which I thought was interesting. But it is, I think it's about challenging. I think we have to challenge practice. And maybe it's easier for me to do that because I'm no longer working in the NHS, I'm retired. But for many people, it's about supporting our friends, being there for each other, I think is absolutely crucial. And thinking about how we can support our friends and our family, our women friends, through the difficulties that they face. In terms of national policy, difficult to say at the moment with mental health funding going down rather than up.
Mm-hmm.
But I am very concerned about the idea that we're overdiagnosing mental health problems, because that is going to fall on women, because there's far more women than men with common mental health problems. Those are the ones that are no doubt being overdiagnosed, because that's where the increase has come since the pandemic. And that worries me very much. I think that is going to affect women.
Couldn't agree more. And just to be clear, when you mentioned to your male colleagues, it was getting away with borderline personality disorder.
Well, they're still using emotionally unstable personality disorder, which is no longer, it's not in any classification, but it's one much loved by psychiatry.
Thank you. And Rebecca, thoughts about where we should be putting our efforts to improve the care we deliver and supporting women around us?
It does feel a little bit difficult because without the resources, and resources are, it's getting worse. It's hard to then put the focus on improving things for women, which we want to do as women and as people, really. And I agree with what Linda's saying. I think I do think supporting each other as other women, working as well, though, that is something we can still do, even if we haven't got any actual money, because it helps to talk about people and to think about things that you might not have otherwise thought of. And I think that goes for men and women, but personally I do get a lot out of talking with women generally. I've got a lot of women friends, so.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both so much. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. It's been wonderful to see you in the numbers at the bottom of the screen and to hear your comments and questions. And we'll put all those to Rebecca and Linda and report back in our document that we'll send out. As I mentioned, there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar. You can share reflections, thoughts, comments, questions, and then the recording will be sent to you. So that just leaves me to say thank you to Cambridge University Press and to Dr. Rebecca Lawrence and Professor Linda Gask. Thanks very much.